Listen, if overthinking is getting in the way of your personal development, if overthinking is stopping you from taking action and making a positive impact in the world, if overthinking is stopping you from unlocking your potential and getting your life in order, then you need to get that under control. So let's talk about some ways in which you can do that. I'm going to get very practical in this video because that's how I like to roll. I like to be really practical. And let's talk about overthinking from a psychological perspective and the kinds of treatment that I use in therapy to help people who are overthinking. So firstly, what is overthinking? So overthinking can manifest in many different ways. The basic definition would just be thinking a lot more about a subject than you need to for it to be helpful. So this is when your thinking starts to become unhelpful. It's no longer linear, it's almost circular. And that kind of overthinking, again, can manifest in many ways. In therapy, I think the most common ways that I see it manifesting is through anxiety. So that's when someone is overthinking about the future. They're constantly anticipating things. Ooh, what's going to happen if I don't get this job? And what if I fail my test? Or what if my partner cheats on me? And you get stuck in these loops because it's really scary. The thing that you're thinking about is really scary. And so you get stuck in a loop thinking about this, right? So that's one way. Another way that overthinking can manifest is things that happened in the past. So this is usually related to depression, sadness, guilt, shame. Your mind sort of gets fixated on this memory, this thing that happened, and it's really difficult to move forward from it. This could be perhaps you've done something that you're ashamed of. You froze when you were supposed to do a speech. So you feel really embarrassed. And for the whole day or for the next week or maybe even months, you think about that. You wake up and you have that cringy feeling and you're, oh man, that should not have happened. But your mind gets stuck in that loop. Another word for this is rumination. That's when you get stuck in some sort of negative loop of thinking, rumination. But rumination and depression is more past-oriented. Anxiety is more future-oriented. Anxiety is where you're anticipating what's going to happen, and there's some fear in that. But the point is that regardless of how you're overthinking, overthinking can manifest in many ways, and it can be future-oriented in the case of anxiety or past-oriented in the case of depression. And so it's really important for you to understand how to control this process, because if you're not in control of this process, it can override your life. It can occupy so much of your attention that it takes you away from the things that actually matter to you. It can stop you from taking action. There's something called analysis paralysis, where you're just thinking about something so much that it's difficult to make any forward movement on it. It's difficult to make a decision on what you should do and to move forward from that. And so if you are overthinking, let's talk a bit about what I would do in therapy if I had a client who was going through what you're going through. And so in therapy, how we'd understand someone who's overthinking is we'd use the label cognitive defusion. Cognitive defusion basically just means that you are trapped by your thoughts. You're a slave to them. And the origin of the word is cognitive is a fancy German word for thinking. And defusion means not to be fused with something. So you're not enmeshed with it. Therefore, cognitive defusion is about getting yourself out of your thinking, getting yourself unstuck from it, being able to see your thinking from a distance rather than being enmeshed with your thinking. That's the psychological process that we study, and that's a label that we use for it. So someone who's overthinking, we would say that they're high in cognitive fusion, because they're really fused with their thinking. It's very sticky. It's hard to get out of it. Maybe it's even hard to not behave in accordance with it. So what we want to help the client do is move from a state of cognitive fusion to a state of cognitive defusion. Cognitive defusion meaning not being fused with that thinking, meaning being able to see it from a distance, not having to act in accordance with that thinking. Okay. If you think about an analogy, cognitive fusion is being swept downstream by the river, being in the water and being pulled by that current downstream. Cognitive defusion is sitting on the riverbank and being able to watch the river flow by. In other words, if you think about the river and the water that's flowing as your thoughts, you want to be able to sit on the riverbank and watch that stream of thinking float by. You don't want to be stuck in the river being pulled downstream with it. And here, I think it's important to give a caveat that we don't want to stop the overthinking. We want to be more aware of it, and we want to have freedom from it. In other words, emotional and behavioral freedom from the overthinking. That should be the goal. And this is because as therapists, we understand that the brain just generates thoughts. That's what it does. It's like a conveyor belt of thoughts that are constantly running by. It's a thought generation machine. That's what this organ does a lot of the time. The heart beats, the lungs breathe, and we shouldn't be ashamed if our lungs or our heart is doing what it should be doing. And the same applies to your thinking. You shouldn't be ashamed if your brain is constantly generating thoughts. The problem comes in when the constant generation of thoughts creates emotional distress, or it creates behavioral problems where you're behaving in accordance with your thinking, and that's not necessarily helpful behavior. So you see, the problem of overthinking is not the overthinking itself. It's more the fact that it can make you feel bad and it can make you behave badly. Those are the two issues. And the last thing I'll say here is, even if you do try to stop your overthinking, you're not necessarily going to be able to do that. We're not necessarily in control of all the spontaneous thoughts that pop into our mind. Because if you think about it, you didn't choose that. Whenever you're overthinking, you're not choosing to constantly think about things. They're just sort of popping up in your mind. Alan Watts says thoughts pop up in our mind like hiccups. They just come up like that. So trying to stop them is assuming control for a process that you're not necessarily in full control of. I hope that makes sense. But that's the rationale behind it. And that's why we want to move from being fused without thinking to being defused. Move from being swept down the river with the water to sitting on the riverbank and being able to observe that stream. We don't need to stop the stream to gain emotional and behavioral freedom from it. So let's move into treatment now. Let's talk a bit about how do you do that? How do you get out of the river? How do you stop being swept away with the stream of thinking and sit on the riverbank and be able to watch it with some emotional and behavioral freedom? Well, I think the answer lies in being able to not take your thoughts literally. You have to realize that thoughts are just thoughts. So take a moment to think about your thinking. What are thoughts? Right? If you just take a moment to think about it, what are thoughts really? Because they're not out here in reality. You can't see them, you can't touch them. What are they? A neuropsychologist would say that thoughts are mental representations of reality, which means they're not reality. They're mental representations. You are representing reality. So it's like a map. In the same way that the map is not the actual territory, in the same way that the map is not the actual place, your thoughts are not actual reality. They're pictures of reality. And those pictures are in the form of images and the form of words. So you can have little strings of words in your mind that form your thinking, and you can have little images or memories or whatever else. But either way, it's not reality. Those are just like little cartoon drawings of reality. Now, the important thing to realize is that when you're thinking, you're not seeing reality, you're seeing your interpretation of it. And your interpretation of it is biased. It's biased because you're not all-knowing. You're not some all-knowing being that has perfect knowledge of everything. You're making guesses, estimates, assumptions. You're creating fuzzy representations of what you think is going on. So your thinking is not necessarily reality. I think it's very important to know this because this can help us step outside of the thinking. This is what helps us not take it literally, not take it as literal truth, because your thoughts aren't literal truth. Don't think so highly of yourself. You do not have literal truth in your mind. You are a specific being who comes from a specific culture with a specific background, with a specific limited human biological brain. And so your thoughts are a product of that. Okay, you're not a prophet. You're not some all-knowing being. You are a human being. Okay, so that's the first thing to realize. Once you realize that, then you can start to think about, are my thoughts helpful or not? So instead of assuming that they're accurate and focusing on the accuracy of your thoughts, you should focus on, are they helpful? Is the overthinking helping me in the situation, or is it hindering me? Maybe the overthinking is helping you. Maybe it's helping you plan, problem solve, or do something else that's helpful. If it's not helping you, and you know that it's not necessarily reality, that is when you're going to be able to step away from it and treat it as just thoughts, as little words and images that are popping into your mind. That's how you're going to gain emotional and behavioral freedom from that. So some practical ways to do this, and this comes from acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a kind of therapy modality that some therapists use. It's very useful. So within that therapeutic modality, there are techniques called cognitive defusion techniques. And those are ways in which you can view thoughts as just thoughts. So one way is, if you're having unhelpful thoughts, is you can sing them to the tune of happy birthday. So if you have the thought like, oh, I'm so useless, based on some embarrassing event that happened, you could literally go, I'm useless, I'm useless, I'm useless, I'm useless, do 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 do. And that is, as silly as it sounds, a way to realize that that thought is just a thought. Even as you do it, you'll notice that, oh, this feels silly. And that's good, because it's creating a bit of distance from the thought. You're not taking it seriously. You're not taking it as literal truth. Another way to do it is, if you're having the thought, I'm useless, is you could set a 30-second timer, and then you could, as fast as you can, repeat that phrase. I'm useless, I'm useless, I'm useless, I'm useless. And if you keep doing that, I'm useless, I'm useless, I'm useless, I'm useless, I'm useless, even as you're hearing it, you'll realize it's just sounds. It's just sounds. Again, that helps you create emotional freedom. And research shows that it takes about 30 seconds to take most of the emotional punch out of the thought, which will then give you the behavioral freedom. So these are just two practical ways to do this. But the premise of this whole conversation is that you don't want to take your thoughts literally. You want to realize that they're just representations. And you want to ask yourself, are these representations helping me or hindering me? If they're hindering you, then you intentionally step away from them and remind yourself that they're just thoughts, and use cognitive defusion techniques to enhance that distance, such as singing them to the tune of happy birthday or repeating them really quickly for about a 30-second period. So those are just two helpful and practical strategies that you can use to overcome your thinking, so that you can release yourself from it, regain control of your behavior, and make the kind of positive impact that you want. Now, if you'd want to take your personal development a bit further, I have a free masterclass where I discuss 5 non-negotiable tools from therapy that are absolutely essential for your personal development. If you're interested in that, you'll find the link in the description below. But until then, I hope you continue to believe in yourself and the positive impact that you can make.